Good afternoon. I'm Bill Shambra, Director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled The Nonprofit Sector and Advocacy Challenges Ahead. It's a special pleasure and honor once again to co-host an event with the Alliance for Justice, which gives me the opportunity once again to work with the always energetic and thoughtful Sue Hochstetter. A special welcome to our viewers, our thousands of viewers over live stream. When we originally scheduled this discussion some time ago, little did we realize that it would be as timely as it is. We were prompted originally by Independent Sector's publication of one of the most exhaustive accounts of the ends and means of nonprofit advocacy we are ever likely to see. I personally laid low several substantial stands of Georgia pine when I downloaded the report and printed it out, and that didn't even include the appendices. Among the many valuable parts of the report are some half-dozen extensive case studies of successful advocacy groups, including one on an organization very much in the news today, Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform, the sponsor of the tax pledge that every candidate for public office is asked to sign forswearing support for any sort of tax increase. The inclusion of ATR speaks to independent sector's generosity and broad-mindedness, since its president, Diana Aviv, frequently points with alarm to Mr. Norquist's determination to, as he puts it, shrink government to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub. Although today we would be hard-pressed to drown government even in the legendary White House bathtub specially ordered for the 320-pound William Howard Taft. The independent sector's report, Beyond the Cause, the Art and Science of Advocacy, is timely in a more important respect as well. For at this very moment, the nonprofit sector is engaged in a vigorous debate among its own most prominent associations about how to respond to growing pressures from the White House and from Capitol Hill to weigh in on proposals like raising taxes on our wealthiest citizens and shrinking the charitable tax deduction. This moment illustrates a deeper truth, a deeper problem, I would say, about nonprofits and advocacy. The vision usually conjured up by that notion is that good-hearted, public-spirited nonprofits will bring their influence to bear on narrow-minded and self-interested partisan politicians to do the right thing for a change, as if the process were somehow a one-way street. But alas, it is in fact a two-way street. Sooner or later, those public-spirited advocacy nonprofits will face reciprocal demands from those self-interested partisans for the old quid pro quo, to do possibly the wrong thing. Suddenly, nonprofit advocacy becomes a much more complex and contested concept. As it turns out, not coincidentally, but through stunning prescience on the part of the Bradley Center and Sue Hochstetter, our panel today includes representatives of several of the most important parties to that vigorous contest. We will hear first from the president of Independent Sector, Diana Aviv, the chief author of the report that inspired the panel. Then we'll hear from Steve Taylor, director of the public policy work underway at United Way Worldwide. Then we'll hear from Sean Dobson, field director at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. And finally, Nan Aaron, founder and director of our co-host organization this afternoon, the Alliance for Justice. So, Diana.
Well, thank you for that terrific invitation. And I must say, whatever you say, whether I agree with you or not, you say it so beautifully that I'm ever impressed. As Bill has described, I was asked to come here today, I think my colleagues as well, to talk about the study that we published in late September called Beyond the Cause, the Art and Science of Successful Advocacy. Our overall goal, independent sector's goal, was to better understand how charitable organizations working in national public policy issues that affect the ability, excuse me, of most charitable organizations to achieve their missions, better understand how they do advocacy, and further to explore whether there's a way in which they might improve their work together or alone. This study was about many things, but I also want to describe to you what it was not about. And the reason I say that to you is that in any piece of work, you have to decide the parameters of the work, and some of that will be described by the funding limitations that you have, other the time, and also what you want to focus on. And so this study did not look at state and local advocacy efforts around the same issues, but rather how successful we were in Washington, D.C., in achieving on a consistent basis our goals, regardless of which party was in power or who occupied the White House. And as with any study that's limited in scope, this meant that there are a lot more future areas for everybody to look at, and should the resources be available, we hope to do that as well. For us, though, the value was being able to look at highly successful advocacy efforts of different organizations excuse me, over a sustained period of time, and see how we might learn from those efforts and apply it to our work. When we began this work, we were particularly interested in looking at advocacy efforts of coalitions and how successful they were over time. And the reason we were interested in that is because we are independent sectors created as a coalition of organizations, and we do all of our work in that context. And so we started out hoping that we could find a series of successful coalitions that over a period of time were able to achieve their goals regardless of who was in the White House or who led in Congress, and we weren't that successful in finding any such coalitions. But I will talk a little bit more about that later. Because time is limited, I'm going to share with you briefly what we have learned from this work. In order to try and understand how we might do it better ourselves, we decided to identify very successful organizations that achieved their goals over time. I want to be clear that these aren't the only organizations in Washington, D.C. who've been successful over time, but we wanted to make sure that the ones we studied were. And more than that, to the degree to which we could learn from what they did. So we found 4 successful coalitions that were successful in a particular goal, and 3 organizations that had consistently over time achieved their goals. We took a deep dive look also at the universe of organizations that self-identified as working on sector-wide issues, namely those issues that affect the ability of all of our organizations to achieve our goals. This work builds on the input from over 1,100 people. Sorry, Bill, that's why it was so heavy. We had to include all of those people in, and took almost 2 years to complete. The 7 case studies of different types of organizations and coalitions that were conducted represent a broad range of conservative, progressive, and corporate interests. These organizations and coalitions operate within a larger context, including a political context, and networks of advocacy groups that support or oppose particular policy positions. We were not, for the purposes of this study, interested in their particular policy positions, but rather how they went about achieving their goals. Our focus was to identify those strategies that propel an advocacy agenda forward, paying particular attention to how the organizational coalition navigated political hurdles and other challenges. Our participants were exceedingly diverse on a number of levels, and yet from their successes, we identified 5 elements that they each exhibited. As you might expect, there's a lot more that you'll learn from each of the case studies. And if you do nothing else, I encourage you to read those case studies because they're extremely interesting. Or maybe that tells you a little bit too much about me. But we were struck at how remarkably similar, regardless of their different goals, and also the resources available to them, how remarkably similar their approaches were with respect to these 5 elements. Now, what were those elements? The first one is that the research underscores the importance of sustaining a laser-like focus on long-term goals. Many successful advocates identified a desired outcome that was in 20 or 25 years forward and worked backwards from that goal to achieve it. In other words, they did not evaluate the resources at hand and then ascertain what they could accomplish. Instead, they picked a target far on the horizon and back-planned. They remained focused on the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. They were facile at reading the environment and altering the plan and remaining steadfast towards their ultimate objective. Americans for Tax Reform, the organization that Bill identified, Grover Norquist's organization, offers an apt example of staying focused on the long-term goal, and think back to 25 years ago from where they are now, or at least where they were when our study was published, before they came under all of this fire. But nevertheless, what they've successfully achieved. In fact, it was Grover Norquist who gave us the great quote. In fact, I was in the room. It was the only interview that I actually participated in because I didn't want to influence the outcome, and I didn't think my presence in that meeting would have affected what he said. And so what he said was that almost nothing can be accomplished in 25 weeks, and almost nothing can't be accomplished in 25 years. Secondly, the advocacy involved two distinct elements. One is what is known, or what we came to describe as building activities, which is a sustained commitment to long-term public policy goal overall. And the second are campaign activities, which we describe as very specific actions to promote or to block a particular legislative or regulatory, a policy goal of sorts. And we found that the successful advocates prioritized building elements over campaign activities. Building activities are like a marathon. Runners maintain a constant pace for a prolonged period of time. Their eyes are fixed not on the next bend in the road, but on the long-term goal, and the finish line of 26.2 miles. So examples of building activities include developing relationships with community members, leaders, and organizations with strong ties to targeted public officials. Researching public policy issues in depth, looking for proactive, not just reactive opportunities. Polling to determine public opinion, especially in key districts. Examining how different stakeholders might be affected by a policy change and what influence they may wield in assisting or hindering a particular advocacy effort. Exploring non-legislative opportunities to build reputation, support, or a climate of change. Testing messages to identify the specific language most likely to move an audience, and monitoring the public and political climate to identify windows of opportunity. In contrast, campaign activities are like a sprint. They require a short burst of explosive energy. At least we hope it's a sprint. Sometimes those campaigns feel like the marathon anyway. But in advocacy campaigns generally are concentrated periods of time in which an organization or a coalition mobilizes around a single objective or target that supports the broader goal. Campaigns are often launched in response to a precipitating factor, such as a change in political will or a political climate, like an election, or something outside of politics, like a natural disaster. Many nonprofits are focused primarily on campaign activities alone, but successful advocates spend much more time on building activities. Now, I will comment here that one of the reasons why nonprofits often focus only on campaign activities is because that's all the money that they have. If they had more, they know to do this, it's just that it's not available. So I'm just describing it, I'm not criticizing it. The stronger, though, the building phase, the more likely the entire effort will succeed, including the campaign activity. Said differently, campaign activities are most successful when it's on a basis or on a foundation of building activities which undergirds everything that follows and has been laid in advance. One example comes from our case study of the Human Rights Campaign. When control of the House of Representatives shifted in 2003, HRC realized it would have to work outside the legislative arena to advance its agenda. It responded with a two-pronged strategy. The first involved Hollywood, encouraging producers, directors, and writers to offer more positive depictions of gay characters. The other part of HRC's strategy involved businesses and the creation of a corporate equality index, which ranks Fortune 1000 companies on LGBT-friendly practices. Engaging Hollywood and launching the index were effective building activities at the time when HRC had concluded that they would have faced great difficulties on Capitol Hill. And all of this is spelled out in great detail in those studies. I'm just giving you a smidgen right now. Third, the study showed that it is imperative to understand the motivation of public officials fully, a theme that surfaced repeatedly during our evaluation. And I might add, in our work that we're doing on the charitable deduction right now, I would say that that is definitely true. Many successful advocates conduct a power analysis to determine who has the power to make change, the change you want, as well as deep research into the public officials' backgrounds, networks, priorities, associations, what's important to that public official. And so the goal is to ascertain what would likely motivate them to support the position of that organization. The more aligned the organization's arguments on an issue appear to be with the public official's agenda and not vice versa, the more likely he or she will be to support that issue. Some study participants said that they thought that policymakers would support them because theirs was a good cause. But this particular finding showed otherwise. Regardless of the merits of the cause, officials were more apt to support it if it was in their own best interests. A good example of this is also from HRC case study. They spoke about their 6-senator strategy, where they ascertained that each of the 6 senators' particular needs, and they developed a strategy around that. And I would say that it was just some of those, just to give you an example, it was getting op-eds placed in his state, in the 4 main newspapers, in support of a particular bill. Another, they learned how he voted on a variety of things and left him alone if it was useful, and if not, they would get local folks to reach out. But in each case, they had a very different strategy for each senator. It was interesting to us. The head of HRC, Joe Solemnisi, came to our conference that we held just a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco, and he described this strategy and how complicated it is. And he also described, which I'm sure that some of my fellow panelists are going to point out, how expensive such a strategy is. Because in order to do that, you really have to be labor intensive in doing the kind of research and understanding the details and how exactly that person might find common cause with you on that particular issue. Now, our fourth element, our assessment revealed that successful advocates used coalitions judiciously and selectively. And a coalition was seen as one of many tools in the advocate's arsenal. I should probably say in the advocate's quiver. Arsenal sounds a little bit militaristic, but nevertheless, we were surprised by the fact that successful advocates were highly discerning about the use of coalitions. It was particularly surprising to us because we are founded on a coalition model, and what we were learning is that even the model that we're founded on was not always so useful. They used them selectively, and on some occasions they determined that actually not working within the coalition was exactly the way to achieve their goals. A big surprise for us. Effective advocates form a coalition around a specific issue, and then they retool or disband as needed. And theirs was a very deliberate act based on specific circumstances. Just one quick observation about this. There's a lot of discussion about this in our case study on the Human Rights Campaign, and you would be interested to see how they then had to mitigate the hurt feelings of fellow HRC travelers in that space who felt that they'd been excluded and didn't like that at all. So there are consequences to operating that way, but they felt that that was how they needed to achieve their goal and demonstrated it. In addition, membership in an effective coalition is based on a needs analysis, first determining what is needed in terms of skills, access, assets, and then determining which organization together would achieve or be best at doing what particular tasks. It is seen not only as not inviting one's friends, but that some of the most successful coalitions had unlikely bedfellows traveling together. And so, for example, over there, or for examples, I encourage you to take a look at our 4 mini case studies, which included Health Care for Americans Now, Patriots Defending the Bill of Rights, the Reentry Prison Group, and the panel on the nonprofit sector. I would say particularly the Patriots Defending the Bill of Rights had the folks from the Americans for Tax Reform and others on the conservative side working with the ACLU to achieve that particular goal. But the same was true with the prison reentry group, and to some degree, or to a lesser degree, I would say, with the Healthcare for Americans Now. There it wasn't a left-right coalition, but it was business interests that coalesced around that. Finally, we found that strong ethical leaders were critical to successful advocacy. And this was true in all of the cases. Such leaders demonstrated integrity and transparency, built enduring relationships based on trust, and articulated a compelling vision and mobilized people around it. They also did not personally disparage their opponents. There were no ad hominem attacks on their personalities of their opponents. They were in fact highly respectful. There were many examples given to us of Grover Norquist being in green rooms with people who were clearly on the other side of the spectrum, and his being highly respectful towards those folks. He was quite free to attack the ideas and the positions they had, but there was never a personal attack. And the same was true with all of these leaders. In this study, leaders earned credibility by being honest brokers who shared reliable information in a transparent way. Those with a history of advocacy were particularly effective because it takes time to forge long-term trusting relationships. In addition, successful leaders excelled at motivating people and conveying a steady long-term vision and charting a path to accomplish it and offering course corrections as needed. They also showed flexibility. They were clear on their goal, but they were very flexible on their approach. Those with a history of General Electric, CEO Jeff Immelt, since they were one of the studies the cases we studied, described in our case study epitomizes these qualities. GE's approach to public policy is driven by Immelt's vision to integrate government relations into all levels of their business. And I'm not going to go through it in detail because I'm mindful that time is marching on. But just suffice it to say that GE has positioned itself as an honest broker and a trusted agent by peers who travel in that space. And one of the reasons why they ceded quite a lot of power or authority to GE to make the deals is precisely because of feeling that he was a trusted partner. Very briefly, let me describe the second part of our study, in which IS applied the findings from that first part of the study to community organizations engaged in sector-wide issues. Now, let me be clear what I mean by sector-wide issues. Again, it's those issues defined as ones that are significant to the entire sector itself, or almost all of the sector, and there are such issues as the charitable tax deduction, those sorts of things. These issues were not intended to represent the most important or the most urgent issues, but were chosen from a list of 50 legislative and regulatory issues that were identified to us by this universe of organizations, and also the ones that they recommended that we take a look at. To better understand how our sector worked together on these issues, we created network maps after interviewing extensively these folks in a variety of ways, and we did an analysis of the networks of organizations engaged in, we identified, I think it was 6 issues to look at. And what we found is that the network is less successful than it could be for several reasons, including lack of coordination, resources, not a clear understanding of what the goals are, a commitment to their own organizations and their goals and not to the common goal, not having access to adequate research, not having access to tested messages, and the deep relationships, and not having very deep, sustained relationships with a broad range of public officials necessary for a particular activity. That it was clear that the status quo didn't have the building blocks to produce on a consistent basis successful policy results. We did see examples of episodic successes, and that we believed that there needed to be a structural shift and an infusion of resources in order to achieve the desired goal. So based upon the 4 coalition profiles, the 7 and the 3 detailed studies, as well as the many interviews we did, we came to the conclusion that there needed to be one coordinating organization that took responsibility, at least issue by issue, but it could be for broader than that, took responsibility for maintaining focus, building the necessary elements of advocacy, and coordinating strategy across allies and partners. It was for us the logical conclusion, but we don't think it's a new or a novel idea. Mark Kramer of FSG has been writing about this for years and has cited numerous examples of coalition efforts that were successful precisely because what he described as a backbone organization took responsibility. In fact, many times you will hear Mark and others say the big problem is that nobody wants to take responsibility, not the big problem is that someone will. A great example of the work he cites is Jeff Edmondson, who founded Strive, which is largely based on this very idea. Let me just say very briefly, this organization would do things like be responsible for maintaining and ongoing building efforts that I described earlier on, work closely with other organizations to build out the grassroots and the grass tops connections to public officials, conduct or commission deep research into the issues, perform detailed analysis of the public policy officials' priorities and motivations, and assess options and opportunities for a proactive action. We knew that both the analysis and the gaps in the way in which we work would invite a vigorous conversation. I believe that this is one of those conversations which we totally welcome. We think that's exactly what's needed. Whenever we ruffle feathers or one suggests a change to the status quo, of course that is going to generate debate about whether the idea that has been suggested is a good idea or a bad idea, and what were the motivations for that idea. So I welcome that discussion and what you have to say. I think that what we do need to do in the end is to remember that what this is all about is not about who does what, but how well we do it and whether we achieve the missions that we are employed or we volunteer to try and accomplish. And when we do that, and if we can do it effectively and efficiently, then I think we can justify our existence. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me just adjust this up a little bit. Like Bill said, I'm Steve Taylor. I'm Senior Vice President for Public Policy at United Way Worldwide. I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about United Way. Just about everybody I ever talked to is familiar with the United Way brand, but just to talk a little bit about how we're structured. Local United Ways are all across the country. In fact, there's 1,200 local United Ways in the United States, 1,800 worldwide. All of those local United Ways are separate 501c3s. And so we are a network of United Ways. As a network, we raise just about $4 billion a year. That makes us the largest privately funded public charity in the United States. We fund human services, social services all across the country and communities. That level of that dollar amount makes us the largest non-government funder of human services in the United States as well. So we have a lot at stake in what's going on in the country, the government budget cuts, and social services that are provided to folks through charitable organizations. What we have really come to realize, United Way has come to realize over the last decade or so, is that as much as the $4 billion that we raise, the amount of money that governments are spending at all levels on the same issues that we're working on, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not the $3 and $4 billion that we're talking about. So there's been a real realization in our system that we have to engage in public policy. But that level of realization has varied depending on the local United Ways. We have local United Ways, like I said, in every single community. They're made up of local board members with a local CEO and local staff. And those folks reflect the communities that they're in. And so we have United Ways in blue states and United Ways in red states, and their points of view about what's going on in the country they reflect the rest of the country. And so our system is divided as well as far as political ideology and philosophy. So our challenge is to try to find ways to engage our system to get us all on the same page and working on the issues that are critical that we're working on, primarily education-related issues, financial stability, income-related issues, some health-related issues, but critically sector issues. In many communities, the United Way is sort of the heart of the local nonprofit sector, and we have an obligation to look after those issues. So we have this enormous potential to engage our system in advocacy at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And there's an enormous amount of potential for influence because we have local United Way in every single congressional district, sometimes a couple of United Ways, and we have multiple United Ways in every single state made up of those people. And so we have this tremendous potential, but our challenge is to educate them about how they can do public policy in a way that is consistent with the values that they have in their communities. And so a lot of my job at United Way is to do that, is to educate them. Another big part of my job is also working here in Washington with other national nonprofit organizations and associations, and we work very closely with independent sector and others, and have great relationships with our fellow members on the panel and people I see in the audience. And so we work with them as well. And so we also, in our national organization, are going through a process of being sure that everybody that we work with understands what the best strategies are for engaging in public policy. And so that brings me to the independent sector report. And I have to say, when I read it, as I looked at the 5 key factors that Diane identified a few minutes ago, I thought, yes, this is exactly right. And I understand this, and I know this, and I might frame some things different ways, but these are all truths if you are experienced and work in the public policy arena. But the problem is a lot of people who aren't in our world don't really understand that. And for me, the overall report was such a valuable tool because it provides that third-party validation. And so I can go out to my local United Ways that we've been talking with for a long time, who are reluctant to engage in the policy debate, and say, look, here is an authority that you respect with information that gives us the tools and the guidelines for how we can do this. And having that as a resource has been enormously valuable for us. And the same thing at our national level as I talk with people that we work with. And there's some impatience. There's some impatience in how quickly we can do things. And to be able to show that staying focused on long-term goals is what we need to do. If you're in the nonprofit sector, and I'm relatively new to the nonprofit sector. I've been in it for almost 6 years. Worked on Capitol Hill before that. There can be a lot of jumping around on our issues, and I've seen that, and I've seen funders, they'll work on something for a year or two or a couple of years, and then they move on to something else. And it can be hard to keep folks focused for a long time and realize what the long-term goals are. I have some other observations on this particular issue. United Way does not have a position or work on immigration policy at all, but for a long time I did. And I think that if you talk to the casual observer about immigration reform, federal immigration reform, you would have thought it was pretty much over in 2007, I think. There was a debate. There were a number of debates. The Senate and the House each passed bills in 2006. The Senate passed another bill in 2007. They didn't pass. It seemed to be basically done. But if you look back, the most recent immigration reform debate started in probably about 1999. There was a setback on comprehensive immigration reform when September 11th happened. But, a year or two later, it came back up. The advocates, the strange bedfellows, business, and humanitarian folks on one side coming together to work on immigration reform. And it's not done. Sooner or later, immigration reform will happen. We've heard a lot about it lately, but this is one area where we can see a coalition in the middle of a long-term sustained effort to ultimately have comprehensive immigration reform in the United States. I don't know. I'm not going to predict when it will happen. I am now in the observer pool, not deeply engaged in it, but I know sooner or later it will happen. And to help our sector understand that that's how you have to work on issues is really critical. I don't know that it makes sense for me to go through case by case on the items that Diana identified, but in each of those cases, these are the kinds of messages that we're talking to Local United Ways about, and ultimately hoping that Local United Ways are talking to the small nonprofit agencies that they work with, that they fund, and to get them engaged in these larger issues. I think I could go through each of these, but I think in the interest of time, I will stop now, turn it over to the next panelist, and hopefully we'll have some good time for questions.
Hi, I'm Sean Dobson, the Field Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. I have a bit of a drip in my throat. I apologize for that. Many thanks to Bill and to the Bradley Center and Hudson Institute for once again putting together a really good program and a place where a broad diversity of folks can come together and talk about important issues. And many thanks to Independent Sector and Diana for authoring this important report. My organization has been around for 36 years. We're both a membership organization. We have hundreds of nonprofit members and grant makers who belong to us. We're also a research organization, and we research best practice grant making. And consistently, we find that the most effective grant making is grant making that is intentionally targeted to benefit underserved communities and specifically to empower them. So there's a lot of good stuff in this report, in my opinion, and actually in a former life, I also was a head of a nonprofit advocacy organization. So I was in the trenches myself. And let's start with the good stuff. It's a really good introduction, I think, for what makes for successful nonprofit advocacy. I'd recommend it to anyone who's new to this line of work. A couple little quibbles maybe would be I would have put more emphasis, although the report does make this recommendation, I would have put more emphasis on the need for foundations to fund more advocacy. In other words, the report is basically saying we need more nonprofit advocacy, but I don't think it hammers hard enough on the grant maker part of that equation. We need grant makers to fund more of it. Right now, only 15% of foundation grant dollars go to fund advocacy and civic engagement strategies, only 15%. That number's moved up a little bit in recent years, but it's moving at a too slow of a pace. I also maybe would have emphasized a little more, and the report does touch on this, but I think I would have emphasized it more, the need for an ecosystem of advocacy groups in a specific domain that handle different niches. And that, for me anyway, came through very clearly in the case study of the Human Rights Campaign. Clearly, HRC was probably, the lead organization, but there are lots of others that have made possible over the past generation the incredible and very inspiring progress of a gay rights agenda. I also maybe would have emphasized a little more the desirability of 501c3s to create a C4 sister organization because elections matter, if you want to be a serious lobbyist, you have to have electoral capacity. Not only to take out opponents who are uncooperative on your issues and to reward your friends, but also as a lobbying tactic. When you walk in the office of a lawmaker and you have a C4, I think they're going to listen, and you have real capacity, they're going to listen more to you, to what you have to say as a lobbyist. There's more good stuff in Section 2. So what I just said, that's pretty much in Section 1 of the report. Section 2 has other good stuff, a good primer on 6 important issues, I think. If you're in this line of work, you should be you should know about these 6 issues. I think you guys all read the report, so I won't tick them off here, but it's a good, pithy and fair-minded primer on those issues. But, and Diana did touch on this, so maybe we'll get into this in the discussion, these self-selected 6 issues could give the misleading impression that these are far and away the most important issues in the nonprofit sector, and indeed ones that nonprofit leaders even care about. I personally would have liked to have seen an open-ended question to respondents, the way they do in many public opinion polls, for example, an open-ended question, and then attempt to summarize that, although that's not really scientific, but I think it would have maybe shown the true diversity of issue agendas in our sector. The one section I didn't like was the final section. I thought it was problematic, because of its central recommendation, namely that there needs to be a single, quote, convener of all nonprofits to lead the coalition, and that this convener should be well funded. The problem, in my opinion, with that is nonprofits are much more diverse than for-profit corporations. For-profit corporations all pursue the exact same goal. They want to make a profit. And in fact, if they're publicly traded, they have a fiduciary and legal responsibility to maximize profit for shareholders. And so for that reason, I think the Chamber of Commerce really can sort of be a convener for at least big business special interests. By contrast, nonprofits are just incredibly diverse. Each one has a different mission statement. Just because they share a tax status doesn't really mean they have anything in common beyond that. And so for that reason, it's hard to imagine a convener, hurting these cats, essentially. Instead, it seems to me inevitable that you're going to have just the status quo, which is coalitions, temporary coalitions, a constantly shifting constellation of temporary coalitions coming together around specific issues, and they work together, and then it dissolves again, and each organization goes its own way. What really kind of, I think, this past couple of weeks has really shown what I just said is true, is the incredible diversity of opinions that nonprofits have about the president's proposal to cap charitable tax deductions. But before I get into that, let's be clear about, it's just one part of his comprehensive proposal to help us avoid the fiscal cliff. Before I get into that, though, let's be clear that this fiscal cliff is not a fiscal crisis. It's a manufactured political crisis. And people forget that, and certain various serious people, in the words of Krugman, want us to believe it's a fiscal crisis. It's not. It's a manufactured political crisis, but it is a crisis and it has to be dealt with. Because if we don't, we're going to almost certainly go back into another recession. What would the president's proposal do? Well, he's putting forward a balanced and comprehensive plan that would include progressively raised revenue and some spending cuts. One element of the progressively raised revenue is his proposal to cap the charitable deduction for the richest of the rich. He's also made it clear that maybe if enough progressively raised revenue of other sorts can be found, that he would spare the charitable deduction or make his proposal more modest. The effect of this would be quite minimal on nonprofits if the president's proposal were to be enacted. According to CBPP, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, it's about 1.3% drop in revenue for the nonprofit sector. According to the Center on Philanthropy, it'd be a 2-point-something drop in revenue, 2.7%. So, we're talking about 1 to 2% essentially. It's not a big deal in terms of overall revenue for the sector. The reason I think for this diversity of opinion on this mega issue facing us, the cap on charitable deductions, is because most nonprofits take seriously their own mission statement, which almost never says anything about defending the current form of the charitable deduction at all costs, no matter what. Look at nonprofit mission statements, you'll almost never see that. Instead, most nonprofit mission statements usually focus on a goal of serving a certain population, often a vulnerable population, or promoting a certain beneficial activity. When you apply most nonprofit mission statements in a spirit of enlightened self-interest, and I stress that, enlightened self-interest, it is clear that the best outcome to the fiscal cliff crisis for most underserved populations, which is why we get out of bed each day, most of us, would be a deal that preserves vital government programs by relying to the extent possible on progressively raised revenue. And for that reason, a lot of massive nonprofit public interest organizations have put out an open letter, for example, recently by the NAACP, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and other groups, and they don't mention the charitable deduction. They say instead we need to raise tax rates on the wealthy, we need to prevent cuts to vital programs, and we need more long-term infrastructure investment to ensure shared prosperity going forward. This diversity of opinion in the nonprofit sector on this issue also manifests itself in not just in organizations taking a firm stand in concrete on it, but also certain organizations evolving their position on it. And for that reason, I applaud the independent sector for this week revising its own position on this thorny issue. And as I understand it, you now embrace the president's call for raising rates on the wealthiest. I'll get into that in the discussion then. Alas, not all leading nonprofits and big grant makers have embraced an enlightened self-interest of this sort. Instead, we're seeing, unfortunately, in some cases, a kind of narrow, obsessive concern only on the charitable deduction. And let me just quickly tick off some reasons why I think that's misguided. First, in an age of an increasing gap between the 1% on the one hand and the 99% on the other in terms of income and wealth, government needs revenue to pay for the programs that foster equality of opportunity. That means preserving those programs and paying for them with progressively raised revenue. And in the context of the fiscal cliff, such a solution would also help us avoid another disastrous recession, because if we go over that cliff, most economists agree that it's going to be a nasty recession. Second, an obsessive defense of the charitable deduction risks undermining the nonprofit sector's leadership position in society. It puts us outside the mainstream. After all, we just had a national election where President Obama was a little vague on his plans for his second term, but the one issue he was crystal clear about was his determination to make sure that the wealthiest of the wealthy finally start paying their fair share of taxes. So his election, which was lopsided, was absolutely a mandate on that specific issue. We don't want to be putting ourselves, I don't think, at odds with that. And it forfeits our sector's biggest asset, which is our moral authority, by making us look like just another selfish special interest, defending only our narrowest organizational self-interest and our tax privileges. If even the major oil companies now support a carbon tax, and they do, surely major nonprofits can practice the kind of enlightened self-interest that would lead them to not only defend the charitable deduction, but also advocate for a fiscal cliff solution that benefits underserved communities in the broadest sense of the term. Finally, the best way to defend the deduction is to push for other types of progressively raised revenue. And the biggest source of progressively raised revenue on the table right now that has a realistic chance of being in that package is the president's proposal to raise rates on the richest 2% of Americans. That takes the pressure off any tampering with the charitable deduction, to the extent that that's the revenue source that's in the package. So I want to try to respect my 12-minute limit. I want to be invited back to these in the future, Bill, so I'll wrap it up now by concluding. Let's all read our mission statements right away. I'm assuming most people in this room are work for a nonprofit, because in the next few days, many of our nonprofit organizations will probably be forced to decide up or down on a fiscal cliff deal that will have many components. As we rapidly assess that overall deal to decide whether it promotes or hinders our own mission, we need to apply that or view our own mission statement through a lens of enlightened self-interest as to what would best help the populations we serve. If the overall deal preserves vital government programs relying mostly on progressively raised revenue and thereby also helps our country avoid another recession, I think most nonprofits would support such a deal because they realize the nonprofit sector as a whole can easily absorb a mere 1 to 2% drop in revenue that would result from capping the charitable deduction. Such a deal, and I hope it can be reached, would not only be consistent with most of our mission statements, but indeed promote them. Finally, I don't see how a convener in the nonprofit sector could play a constructive role in this huge issue because nonprofits, as I said before, are all over the map on it. There's different positions about it. Right here at this table, there's different positions. But you know what? If I had to, I've been in the nonprofit sector a long time. I think a majority probably support the president. They want an overall fiscal cliff deal that will help underserved populations, even if it means a drop of 1 to 2% in the revenue for our sector. So I look forward to the questions and answers, and I guess I'll wrap it up. Did I meet my time limit? Thank you. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Nan Aaron, President of Alliance for Justice. Thank you to Bill for hosting this interesting discussion. For those of you who don't know, Alliance for Justice has a program called Boulder Advocacy, which works probably with many of you in this room, and our goal is to work with nonprofits to be more effective, more strategic, bolder, more courageous, by understanding the IRS FEC rules that affect your ability to do advocacy. And next year, we will be adding a new offering to Boulder Advocacy, and that is a program that addresses skills building for nonprofit groups. So with that, a few comments about the report and then a few of my own. The first thing I would do is commend independent sector for beginning this conversation and for undertaking such a massive look at advocacy. Whatever your feelings are, it was an incredibly comprehensive report, and I'm very pleased that it did emphasize advocacy as much as it did, and that it causes all of us to look at the sector and look at the work we're doing, and enhance and expand the advocacy work that we've undertaken. I think Sean touched on this briefly. I think our general criticism, and I should just say that we did release a paper about the report, a pretty comprehensive paper a few weeks ago, and I think you all received a copy in the notice to this. I think our primary concern with the report was its call for millions of dollars to be spent for administrative, sector-wide problems, and for those problems to be addressed by a single organization. I think, as Sean has indicated, our nonprofit, our wonderful nonprofit world, is very disparate. It is not monolithic. We have small groups, large groups, middle-sized groups, totally diverse, different. And the fact remains that our concerns, particularly of those of the advocacy community, are very different from some of those groups and recommendations that are reflected and contained in the report. What I would do with all those millions of dollars is I would love to see that money go to organizations at the national, state, local levels to get engaged in this incredible debate underway in this country about the size of government. There is no question but that our world, our country, is being recreated. It will be different this year and in the future. And unless nonprofit organizations have the resources to be involved in that discussion, in that debate, they will find, as others have said, that their interests and concerns will just simply not be addressed. It's the old adage, if you're not at the table, you'll be on the menu. But it's absolutely true for all of us in this room and listening. The fact is, nonprofits are being whipsawed. We are being whipsawed by the needs of our constituents and the shrinking resources we have to address those needs. And just this week, we saw forces amassed in the state of Michigan to deliver almost a fatal blow to working families in the state of Michigan. And that's just a piece of this. There is a huge fight in this country, and nonprofits have to be at the forefront of that fight. In fact, the whole project, Under Attack, has been around since the New Deal. And what some forces want to do is completely dismantle the progress that we have made in this country in civil rights, women's rights, human rights, in pulling together and building a social safety net for our most vulnerable people, environmental consumer protections. There are forces that don't like that, and they're going to do everything and anything they can do to take away, to remove, to dismantle what has been built since the New Deal. A very interesting study was put out a couple weeks ago that we read about in the Boston Globe that says of all the lobbyists in Washington, D.C., only 5% of those represent vulnerable populations, the environmental community, consumers. So, fellow nonprofits, we got a long way to go to get some balance back in our system. And the fact remains that if we have fewer resources at all levels, the national level, state level, local level, it means that we do less advocacy, because we know that those fewer resources available will go, as they appropriately should go, to serving our constituents. But that leaves us less to use, to be at the table, to lobby, to get involved in discussions with big corporations, government leaders, to ensure that our constituents remain viable and their survival is in tow. The other thing is, we have over the next year or two incredibly big fights ahead. As Sean mentioned some of them, this country will take up a national debate on immigration. It will, we hope, take up a big national debate on the environment. Holy mackerel, we should be talking about our environment. There will be discussions similar to the ones we're having about resources, and workers' rights will certainly be at the forefront of much of what we're going to be focusing on. Organizations need the resources to participate in those discussions. Now, I would add, it's not just the health and survival of the nonprofits who are so critical to participating in these debates, but I would also say it is not a coincidence that forces like the Tea Party want to continue to reduce the number of people who vote in this country. All of us, I'm sure, had experience on election day going to the polls. I know I got to my polling place, I think I was third in line, 7 o'clock. There was one electronic voting machine, and this is in Washington, D.C. Only one. All of us had to sit there and do paper ballots. It took me 3 hours to vote in Woodley Park, Washington. But look at the rest of the country. The long lines, the delays. People showed up at polling booths only to be told they needed voter IDs when laws had already been held unconstitutional requiring voting IDs. We have got to do something about our voting in this country. If you look at a comparison between the United States and other major countries in the world, Australia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, we have among the lowest voting rate in the country. It's 60% of Americans vote. That number should be 80 or 90%. And guess what? The forces out there do not want more of us to vote. They want to keep the number as low as possible. They're afraid that if more of us go to the polling booths, more of us vote, that we might actually take progress forward and move progress. So we've got to be taking a major, major look at voting in this country. It's imperative. Pablo Eisenberg mentioned something in his paper that really grabbed my attention, really based on my experience at Alliance for Justice. And that is one thing that Pablo addresses, is for all of us to look at the boards of foundations. Who sits on these boards? And not surprisingly, we actually at Alliance for Justice did look at the boards of about 25 of the leading foundations in this country. It's not a surprise to say that most of the people who sit on boards are from big corporations, are from the elite class in America. They do not reflect the growing racial, gender diversity in this country, and nor do those boards reflect the growing class divide in this country. That has got to change. We all know that when a board gets together and looks at and consults and reviews the various grants up for consideration, it's important that our voices, voices of environmental activists, consumer activists, social service activists, be represented at those meetings. It's the way that will make change occur. Finally, I appreciated the look that independent sector took when it reviewed the work of, I think, 6 or 7 large organizations, and Diana references that. But a close look at these organizations, Americans for Tax Reform, Human Rights Campaign, General Electric, most of these organizations are actually 501c4 organizations. They're able to spend 100% of their budgets lobbying, and they can get involved in a substantial amount of electioneering work. The fact of the matter is most of our nonprofits can't do that. They don't have the millions at their disposal to carry out these huge advocacy campaigns. And I credit these advocacy campaigns. I think as Diana spelled out for us, they're incredibly impressive, and I think offer us a guidepost as to what our advocacy campaigns ought to look like. But 2 things. Number 1, they're a different animal from most of the organizations in this room. They're probably 501c3s and don't have the millions at their disposal to do this. But number 2, we need to take a look at 501c4s, and I say that in a positive way, not a negative way. 501c4s are the engines that drive the action. In Diana's examples, they were the entities that really make change. If you look at the ballot initiatives taking place around this country, at the forefront of those campaigns are 501c4s. They can act more quickly, more effectively, more aggressively. We at Alliance for Justice will be devoting some time next year to convening 501c4s, figuring out ways to strengthen their activities. They are incredibly important entities in our democratic process, and we will be working with 501c3s to help them build their capacity to take on 501c4 activities. And with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
One item that perhaps Diana would like to address at the outset is the suggestion that drew some fire from our panelists, not just today, but previously in print, about that central unifying organization, the need for one entity to kind of lead the way. And you hinted at the reasons for that suggestion in your opening remarks, but could you return to that now in light of what we've heard and just sort of reiterate your reasons for wanting to see something like that and why the objections that we've heard aren't necessarily dispositive.
Sure.
And anything else you want to say? I mean, obviously, as you pointed out, I'm very libertarian in my approach to.
Sure. So the question is, why did we? I believe the question is, and the critique is, why do we think that it would be valuable or viable or effective to have one convening organization? So let me be clear about what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that there's one convening organization that's the mistress of the universe, or the master of the universe that controls everything and decides on the agenda or anything like that. That's not, in fact, what we said, and it's not what we believe. What we said is that when organizations work together around an issue or a set of issues that they share in common, that the most effective outcomes have been when there's been a lead convening organization. And there are multiple examples. So, for example, in the Patriots Defending the Bill of Rights, even though it was a left-right coalition, the ACLU was the backbone organization that provided the background work, that did all the building activities, that brought the others to the table and played that lead role. The same is true with a much smaller coalition in the case of the prison reentry group, and the same was true with every example we found where there was successful advocacy and successful outcomes, whether it was very local and very small or it was large and global, that there was one lead organization that took responsibility for making sure that the coalition went forward, that there was funding, that the research that everybody needed, the polling that everybody needed happened. Who that organization is can vary from time to time depending on what the issues are. So that, for example, if there are a group of foundations that are upset about a given set of issues that are distinctive and unique to foundations, then the lead organization likely would be one from that universe. If there's a group of organizations upset about something else, Steve identified immigration, Nan mentioned it too. I was very involved in the immigration movement, the backbone organization in that regard. So my point was, or our point was, wasn't just mine, it was based on the study, is in looking at who is successful, that's the model that seems to be the best. I find it very interesting how quickly that people assume two things. One is that we wanted to be that lead organization, which is not the case. And two, that we wanted all that money to come to us so that we would be an empire builder. And the argument was made around the diversity of the sector. By the way, I think the diversity of the sector is true within subsectors, and it's true in the business community. This is a very heterogeneous society with lots of views in all ways. And what we are talking about is in a given area where people are working, that a backbone organization is the model to do so. We actually even say so. I think if we continue to do it the way we're doing, as has been suggested, we will continue to have episodic success and universal failure, and we won't have been able to build on each other's efforts of case building. So I've got some points on the others as well, but I can wait.
Sure. Let me just follow this up. I mean, Sean and Nan, who can disagree with that? I mean, it just seems so commonsensical. I mean, aren't you guys being a little harsh here?
I may have read the report wrong, but I don't think so. I mean, I agree in principle with that. For any one campaign, it only makes sense to have a leader or a very small group. But I have to say, I read your report as calling for independent sector on some of the issues that are discussed in the report as being the leader. And I don't quarrel with independent sector's either leadership or being the leader on those issues. My concern was there are a lot more issues that affect very directly the health and survival of nonprofits. And many of those issues were not touched on by the campaign. And therefore, one of the beauties of our world is that different leaders emerge to do different things. But I did read your report as suggesting that independent sector assume the mantle over a set of cross-cutting issues. I just am saying I don't want that to be the definitive word in this, for this sector, for us or for the funding world. There are too many other issues, and we need to address some of those.
Yeah, Sean, you wanted to?
Yeah, Diana, I agree with what you just said, but that's not how I read the report. What I think you just said is if there's a specific issue, typically victory comes from a coalition, and typically the coalition has a big dog in it. That's the kind of leader. Maybe the funders purposely fund that person to be the convener. And yeah, most victories look like that. But I read the report as saying there needs to be a permanent big dog, a permanent convener, and with the almost inevitable issue agenda of these 6 issues. And the point I was trying to make in my remarks is that those 6 issues are not important to the vast majority of nonprofits that I've ever worked with. They could care less about them, actually. So it's like, convener or what? For an issue agenda that like no one cares about? I don't get it.
Yeah, Steve, please, how did you read this
would
report?
just-
Did we all read the same report? Maybe there were several versions of it? Or?
So I didn't see that Diana said that the independent sector reports that said that independent sector was, going to be the only leader on this or anything like that. But what I would say about the issues is that there are some critical issues to the nonprofit sector that aren't in our mission statements, but they're the means to the end. Our mission statements are very diverse, but at the end of the day, there's certain things that the sector has to be able to do, and we have to be able to, we can't be limited by laws and regulations that are going to make it impossible for us to do our jobs. And I think that's what a lot of this is about. Not what our various ends are, but what how we get there. And a lot of these issues I think are critical, and they're going to become more critical when we do tax reform. They're going to be talking about slicing and dicing the nonprofit sector, and we need to be prepared to everybody's going to have an interest in it.
And just
Diana,
one
please.
quick comment. Look, there's an important discussion to be had that's maybe beginning at this table, or it's been going on for a long time, about what should be the issues that occupy the space that the charitable sector, regardless of their particular missions, should also be talking about. What are those universal, what are the set of universal issues that are so important that they transcend our individual missions and that we should be attending to? There was a spirited defense by Sean about the charitable deduction should not occupy that space, and we can have it. I didn't know today's discussion was going to be about that, and so I'm not going to go there just for this minute. So that's one set of issues. We made very clear in our report, unequivocally, that we were focusing on the kinds of issues that have traditionally in the last number of years occupied that space, and we listed 50 of them, and we got those which we state in the report. Unfortunately, you have to wade through it to see where, but we state in the report that those examples of what those issues were came directly from the organizations themselves. We didn't make them up, what those 50 were. On our agenda is much, much less than 50. It's 3 or 4 at the moment. So from those, we then asked who's working on what right now and what should be the ones that we study. So those were examples of why we focused there. Nan may be right that they are the wrong issues. Others have said that we should pay more attention to different kinds of issues. As to the question of episodic coalitions with a backbone organization, I think this is basically the core issue. When you have only one organization that is the lead organization for a single issue at a single moment in time, essentially what you're describing is a campaign activity. You're not describing a building activity. What we learned from this experience is that the successful organizations had extensive building activities and that they tended to be lodged in one organization that then used it in the service of the campaign. And where organizations wanted to work on another issue, they went off and did that even if that lead organization wasn't involved. We were suggesting that to the extent that the charitable sector firstly agrees on a common set of issues, and let's assume that, although I take your point that we shouldn't necessarily assume that, but I can tell you that there are a lot of people who sit at our table who do assume that, then for those groups, there should be a lead organization. The notion that we said, firstly, we did not state that independent sector should do it. I don't think that our board thinks that independent sector has said that it should do it, and so that is an assumption or conclusion that some may have drawn. Last point I'd say, that anybody who knows anything about the way in which I do my work, I don't announce that I want to be a lead organization and then ask in a public report for money. That is an extremely bad strategy.
Let me ask you, as a panel, one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. If I were a political conservative, let's say, I would listen to this discussion, and it sounds to me like you all, the quarrel here seems to be about how mobilized the nonprofit sector should become behind what is, in essence, a liberal big government agenda. And your disagreement actually sort of fades into insignificance next to this unified desire that you all have, which is to lobby government to be sure that we have the taxes to cover the increasingly generous services that we should be providing. Is that, I mean, for folks who are watching this over live stream, I mean, someone I'm sure, long ago spilled their coffee over this issue if they are in fact a conservative. And so let me just put that there and see if you all, and actually maybe you will all now be able to gang up and be unified against me on this issue. So I will bring unity to the panel.
So I'd like to start out addressing that a little bit. And, you know, United Way is an organization that receives 95% of that funding I described in my opening statement earlier from private sources. So very small amount of government funding comes into United Way. With that said, we are partners with the government. And we fund 37,000 local agencies that are doing fabulous work. They are largely also receiving funding from various government sources. And so we have a significant interest in that partnership with the government in ensuring that services are provided to people. But there's one thing that everybody really needs to be very, very clear about. Any revenue that is going to be raised from the fiscal cliff, whether it's increased tax rates or limiting deductions or whatever, that is not going into the nonprofit sector. That funding is going into deficit reduction. Cuts from government funding to the nonprofit sector are happening. How much they happen may be at issue, but cuts to funding are coming. And so the only alternative source of funding to the nonprofit sector is from private sources. And so that's what this fight is really about, is do we support cuts to the private sources as well as what we know are going to be cuts to government funding, or are we going to try to preserve the private funding knowing that the public funding is going to be cut? That's what I think the debate is about.
Yeah, Sean.
I'll take off my NCRP hat because my organization doesn't have a position on the size of government, but I'm wearing my progressive hat, Bill. Yes. I think a lot of progressives are the goal is not, in your words, liberal big government. I mean, that's not the goal.
I think it's big liberal government.
Oh, big liberal government.
But that's okay.
I'm sorry. By the way, there's a webcast, so we can play that back. And,
oh, okay, that's right. Yeah, there is a record.
The progressives that I work with and hang around with would say, what we're looking for is an effective government that promotes equality of opportunity and opportunity for all. And you could imagine scenarios where you shrink government. Do we really need this bloated defense budget? I mean, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, and Al-Qaeda is at this point like 6 guys in a cave somewhere, right? I mean, how about our tax code riddled with giveaways to multinational corporations? We could save a lot of money by closing those loopholes. How about our communist system of agriculture, where farmers are essentially, it's like Soviet Union circa 1972, right? I mean, they're like in a communist system. It's not a market system, and the same Tea Partiers who are, braying about big government are like at the trough, So, so it's about effective government. I just wanted to get that off my chest.
Gotcha. Yes, thank you. Excellent. Diana.
Bill.
And it should be, I should point out that I've often criticized poor Diana for taking this very position about being in favor of bigger government, and you've become accustomed to my, I'm sure my yeah. But anyway.
Yes, so to be clear, the purpose of the advocacy study was not to look at the role of government at all. One can criticize spending so much money on a study that maybe should have done that, but the scope of the study was about what is effective advocacy. The reason we invited input from organizations that were on the conservative side of the ledger is that we weren't talking about what the content was. Your opening remarks that raised the question of making a finer tuned instrument, namely the advocacy instrument, may be the wrong focus altogether, because surely for what we are, this discussion has now morphed into something else. But before we go there, and I'll comment on that, I do want to say that the organizations we studied, except for General Electric, are 501c3 organizations. I actually asked Grover Norquist the question of whether he supports 501c4 organization, and he said that he doesn't, that his is a C3, because he believes that if he created a C4, that the various government entities that have oversight would in fact investigate him to the point of ineffectiveness. In other instances, they have the Human Rights Campaign has a foundation that's a C3, and then they're a C4, and that there is a big, deep, wide discussion to have about what the role of C4s are, particularly in light of Citizens United for It's Another Time. I think the question of what we lobby for and whether everybody on this table is in the same place, I think is not accurate to say. Maybe from your perspective, everybody who's to the left of you looks all the same. But I think that
I've been accused of that before.
But I think that in the case of independent sector, we have members as diverse as the Boy Scouts and Salvation Army, along with the Open Society Institute, and folks sitting at this table, two of the folks sitting at this table. And so we are a big tent, and we don't have a political view.
Well,
Nan,
my turn.
You want to beat up on me too?
My turn. No, actually I don't, because I'm not going to discuss that.
Okay.
But I think we have to look at two things. One is the huge number of 501c3s in this country. You're a big corporation. You want to set up a charitable foundation. You do that. You join independent sector. That's a good thing. No problem with that. But we've got, how many nonprofits? Hundreds of thousands of nonprofits. But I think millions of nonprofits. Over 1 million, thank you. 1.4, thank you.
But public charities, there are about 1 million.
But I would take this discussion back to the values that are inherent in the nonprofit sector. And I would say, while we've got 1.4 million C3s in this country, the fact is we ought to have our eyes and our work and our studies focused on those organizations whose work is part and parcel of the values that are inherent in why the sector is important. And those are three in my mind. One, as a sector, we're there to represent the most vulnerable people. And representing, voicing their concerns and interests is absolutely paramount. That makes us unique. Number two, what makes us unique as a sector is that we are able and should do a lot more of influencing public policy. That's what makes us unique. And number three, nonprofits have a very particular role in providing, suggesting innovative approaches, being part of the research that's done, the research engine in this country, and then serving up ideas to our policy leaders. But I want to emphasize the first one, and it takes into account groups on the left and on the right. But inherent in that are organizations that speak up and represent those not in the mainstream, but those who do not have a voice. That was, in fact, the building block for independent sector, and that should be evermost in our work and our advocacy when we're talking about what the nonprofit world says, suggests. That is our constituency, and that's a really important one.
I'd kind of like to, I'd agree with what Nan said and her characterization of, what the nonprofit sector should be doing. My only, the only disagreement is sort of, I guess, our approach to how we are able to do that and how we are able to speak for the most vulnerable, and it is it's the difference between us and government is that it's the support from the private sector that we get, and it's this debate right now around the charitable deduction, and I'll probably, now that it's kind of on the table, I'll probably go back to that, but the debate about the charitable deduction is not, from our view, from United Way's perspective, is not a debate about what the deduction rate is for the people at the top of the economic spectrum. I mean, we very much value our donors, but it's because they enable us to do that work. And at the end of the day, the limits on the charitable deduction is really about our capacity to help those people at the bottom of the economic spectrum. We're not engaged in a debate for the sake of defending our donors. We're engaged in a debate about having the resources to be able to help the most vulnerable, and that's what the debate about the charitable deduction is about in our view.
Very good. Well, we have a knowledgeable audience here. I see many familiar faces. Pablo's in the audience, the aforementioned Pablo Eisenberg. Did I see your hand shoot up, Pablo? Excellent. Let's get Pablo's question.
During the discussions, I think
Speak
we,
directly into the.
Okay.
Yeah, really, yes.
during the discussions, we didn't hear anything about the issue of nonprofit accountability and transparency. A major problem given the scandals and some of the other developments in recent years. And we also heard, though, some people pushing for increased number of C4s, scandalously non-transparent in terms of their requirements not to produce who their donors are. So the question that I would ask is, where does the issue of transparency and accountability factor into both your report, Diana, and also the comments of Sean and Nan pushing for more C4s without an accompanying requirement that the C4s be publicly accountable?
Well, I'll start by answering the question that this report was about many things, but it was also not about many things. And one of them it wasn't the scope of the study was to talk about accountability and transparency, even though I think that that is a fundamentally important issue and one which is a major priority to our agenda, one in which we have a website. We've spent many, many years, long before I was there, and since I was there, probably the majority of my time has spent focused on accountability and transparency. I dare say there may be people on the panel who'd say that I'm focusing on the wrong issues because I'm not, because it's about how we do our work as opposed to what the work is. But nevertheless, independent sector was created to ensure that there's accountability. And so I agree that it's important. I don't agree that it should be part of this report. I have no doubt I would have had 100 more criticisms about how diffuse the report is because it's about everything except what it's supposed to be about. On the question of C4s, I think, this might be a first, I think I'm in agreement with Pablo in that I'm deeply troubled, and we have been deeply troubled by the ability of the struggle that we've had within our own sector in our commitment on the one hand to protect the privacy of donors so that donors may give anonymously if they wish, because some would suggest it's the highest form of giving, to not take credit and to give it for whatever purposes, that so long as they believe in that cause, and all the way over to donors who make donations and to unpopular causes, live in a community, and don't want to be jeopardized in some way or their families be compromised because they've made a donation to an unpopular cause. This has been a time-held tradition that our sector, I think, rightly has protected vigorously. At the same time, with the creation of 501c4s, in which a portion of the money, it can't be all the money, but a portion of the money can be used for express political purposes, has created a vehicle, particularly following Citizens United, in which private individuals can give money to C4s, and that money can be used to advance particular candidates or defeat other candidates, and have hidden behind the protections that I've just spoken about. We have been so troubled by this that we convened a work group of our Public Policy Committee to come up with a set of recommendations. And just yesterday, the day before yesterday, at our board meeting, we issued a new statement or a new set of principles that differentiates and says that if donors, I'm paraphrasing, so if I don't have it exactly right, feel free to criticize, but take a look at the statement that says largely that donors that make donations for the purposes of this, or if the organization chooses to use the money that way, the donor needs to be informed, and that those people should be publicly disclosed. We will, in the near future, publish that and develop a whole set of action steps to move in that direction, because we think that if you work in the public space and that organization does that, that should be subject to public disclosure.
Yeah, Sean and Nan.
Yeah, and actually, you know, the fact that Diana has the guts to put this report out there, because you're going to get criticized by everyone for what's not in there or what is in there. I mean, that's why I applaud it. It's a very productive document and has provoked a very fruitful discussion. Pablo, to your question, and I'll be careful of what I say because you're on my board of directors, so I could get myself in hot water here. Absolutely, C4s, you know, I mean, again, I'm taking my NCRP hat off. We haven't taken a position on C4s, but clearly, it's shocking, the abuse of C4s. They're just you know, set up to influence elections with anonymous donors, and at this point, C4s are actually giving more money, I think, than the super PACs. So they're actually kind of the main problem at this point. So clearly, when I said I think effective C3 advocacy oftentimes has a C4 sister organization, absolutely, that you need C4 reform so that you can't have these shadowy, dark money C4s, you know. Pumping millions of dollars into elections. But you know what? I'm going to shut up now because the real expert on C3, C4 is seated right to my left.
Man.
Oops. Pablo, two things. Number one, you know, every problem needs a scapegoat, right? And we know this. Even coalitions need scapegoats. And the scapegoat for the election and secret money and, you know, all the torrent of corporate funds that went into campaigns as a result of Citizens United, the scapegoat appears to be C4s, and I'm very troubled by that, because Alliance for Justice is very much on board with the notion of meaningful disclosure. But oftentimes there are proposals that emerge that really don't get at the heart of the problem, but satisfy some cuckoo member of Congress who wants to rail against 501c4. So we're looking at those proposals really carefully to screen out the frivolous ones and make sure that we can focus on the real meaningful ones. But I want to say something about accountability. We are the most regulated sector probably in the world. Now, there are good things about it, but I know that the lawyers from Alliance for Justice who work out of our Oakland office, and we train in other states around the country. I mean, now, not only do we all need to be familiar with national law, IRS and FEC, but we now have to be familiar with a whole complex of state laws and local laws. And so a nonprofit that wants to speak out on an issue either has to pay money to a lawyer or call us free of charge at our 800 number and get the answer to the question. But I would say, in terms of accountability, I cannot imagine a more regulated community of organizations and the nonprofits in this country. And frankly, I wish we were moving in the opposite direction because it inhibits rather than encourages a lot of important and meaningful work and advocacy.
Good. Kevin. While the microphone is making its way to Kevin Laskowski, let me make this prediction about the work with C4s, your increasing interest in C4s. You will find that your funders will look at that work and say, yeah, now you guys are finally really doing the real impactful work, as they say, of influencing public policy. Let's stop funding all of this ethereal movement building and all this, building alliances over time and long-term goals and 25-year projects. That's all nonsense. When we can give to this C4, we can, create a bunch of really clever ads in the next election and have an immediate outcome to measure.
Bill, that's the difference between your funders and our funders.
You've been... Yes.
But Bill, I think there's another answer from the study. We looked and we interviewed people about the value of PACs, C4s, and C3s. And the universal reaction, universal meaning the majority of the people who were interviewed, so I don't want to suggest that it's broader than that, believed that PACs were actually less helpful than more helpful. Because on the positive side of the scale, being able to bet on the right person and prevail provided access that was distinctive and immediate. The chances of betting on the wrong person was also a possibility, and that could create an equally negative result. In addition to which, there was a deep concern by even those who'd had PACs, that they would be shaken down all the time. Or let me say it differently, that they would be pressed for money before practically anything else.
Right.
In the case of C4s, those organizations that had C4s, and I'm not just talking about the 7 groups that we studied, and they didn't each have, but those, universally, the organizations that had C4s found them extremely helpful, and the ones that didn't couldn't see the great value. And we haven't done an analysis. It would be interesting to understand what that was all about. But there was no one who felt, including, by the way, General Electric, those that had access to large amounts of money, who didn't feel that the most important asset that any organization had was its grassroots members. And what we found most interesting is that those that had large amounts of money found grassroots members, the grass was green on the other side, and those who had access to grassroots members wished they had more money. So each thought that the grass was greener on the other side.
I would like to have more money to activate my grassroots.
Amen.
Mr. Laskowski.
Kevin Laskowski, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. I will keep my comments, I'll watch what I say because I work with Sean. I was particularly interested with Nan Aaron's comment that if you're not on the, you're not on at the table, you're on the menu. The kind of idea where we're defending the charitable deduction. Well, if not the capping on the charitable deduction, what's the alternative? However cynically, what gets on the menu if not the charitable deduction? What's our proposed alternative? We can't simply say to those who would have a position on what we're doing, just no, you can't do this. What do we do instead? But I'd also like you to expand, perhaps more importantly, on what we just heard from. Most of the recommendations for what makes for effective advocacy run counter to most foundation practice. The emphasis on long-term goals, prioritizing building activities over campaign activities, relationships with public officials, of which foundation executives have little. What could you say to those foundations who want to be better advocacy funders? What needs to change? What needs to be done? How do funders get involved? And then perhaps, if you want to, that charitable deduction question.
So it's not just conservative funders who commit that error. It's both, right? Okay, thank you. Although I will fully accept Nan's comment about our funders. You're quite right that our funders, which were once, our funders being conservative foundations and people of wealth, who were once particularly adept at this kind of long-term public policy influence have now become incredibly inept at public policy influence, precisely because they've decided to abandon the long-term view and the coalition building and so forth and so on, and go right for the kill, which is, billboards funded by C4s. Anyway, I'm sorry. Kevin's
I'll take
questions.
a crack. Just
Yeah.
there's been excellent research done on the superiority of this kind of long-term funding, GEO and others on multi-year grants. Sadly, though, NCRP's research shows that, and it's a report that just came out, that the needle hasn't moved. Foundations are not embracing multi-year support, and they're also not really embracing general operating support, which is the other way to build long-term power. So, it actually keeps circling, this discussion keeps circling back to a kind of gripe about funders. And for good reason, they're like, they're just not performing as well as they should. And, whether they're not funding enough advocacy, they're not targeting enough money to underserved populations, they're not doing enough general operating support, not enough multi-year granting. So, that's kind of like an elephant in the room, and the sector, the charitable, or I should say the philanthropic sector needs to improve.
So, I would just say that, getting the funders back thinking about long-term is exactly what a report like this is very valuable for. And actually, you guys have done some great work on return on investment for advocacy. And so I think it's all part of a process of educating the funders, getting back to them and talking to them about, if they really want to have impact, if they want to create long-term change, that they're going to have to start thinking in terms of the return on investment for advocacy and the long-term strategies that are really necessary. And we have to educate them about that.
Agreed with everything that's been said. Part of the reason that we thought this report was valuable was to try and make the case. I must say, when I started, it's publicly known, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, the Gates Foundation funded this. My target in mind was Bill Gates. As a matter of fact, I even met with folks who have had deep experience with him when he was at Microsoft and what his attitudes and feelings were about advocacy, considering that Microsoft company came under fire and had a very, from their perspective, unpleasant experience in Washington, and to the degree to which that, I took the advice from my own report, understand who you want to try and influence and so on, to see whether if we wrote this in a particular way, whether we could make the case. I believe that if the Gates Foundation and the leadership there were to take it to the largest foundations and say that this deep kind of investment doesn't have to be an independent sector, it could be in these works, should be a part of the agenda, and that every foundation should be funding the building phase, that we would all be better off, even as we argue about how that get manifested. So thank you for your question. I think that's right. On the question of what's the alternative to the charitable tax deduction, that's like the elephant and the flea, but let me answer it anyway. Independent sector, and I apologize for interrupting the middle, Sean, of your comment, but the independent sector took a position a year ago, long before this particular fight, about deficit reduction, which Bill's so familiar with, because he enjoys to reinforce his view of seeing me at least to the left of him. Although, anyway, that's another conversation. And in that position, we said that for responsible deficit reduction, we need to have both progressive rate increases and cuts, including to entitlement and discretionary programs, and that this should not be on the backs of poor people, and that the rate increases should be borne by those who are best able to pay. The most recent so we believe that that is the way to go. We think in that respect, in that specific respect, the White House is right, that if rate increases are not on the table, then it will come from every other place, including the charitable deduction, so that our strategy is one that is there. I also understand that the point that was made, I think, by Nan, looking at foundations, I would argue is true for major nonprofits as well. Look who serves on the boards, and many of the leaders who are serving on the boards of those nonprofits say to those executives, say to the professionals, don't take positions on this because it's not in my interest. And we need to get to a point where those leaders understand that they are there as stewards of the organization, not of their pocketbooks.
Yeah, Nancy.
So I would just, this discussion, I don't know if it's an answer to your question, I think for me brings up the fundamental distinction that I am making, which is, I think the role of philanthropy is to fund and build strong organizations at the local and state level and national level. It's about creating and leaving in place institutions who can, for the foreseeable future, be there to offer up ideas, research, as a counter to big corporate, big government entities. So I am about the building of institutions that last long after a foundation goes out of business, as opposed to money going to Washington, D.C. groups to address 6 or 7 issues that affect the nonprofit world. And I believe that for foundations to really be in the business of building organizations, as opposed to getting an idea here or getting an idea of how we ought to correct this system or that system, if we're really about building institutions, then our staffs of foundations have to be individuals who have been active, seasoned participants in that arena. People on the boards need to be seasoned, active participants in that arena, because I think it will be only because the work that is generated by nonprofits but understood by the foundations is able to persist and carry on long into the future. We've seen a bunch of foundations that are spending down over the past few years. And in my mind, there's only one question, and that is, what are they leaving behind in terms of organizations who will be there on health care and human rights and the like? So to me, that's what this is about.
I just have one more comment about the charitable deduction. You're going to be sorry that you raised that, I think, but just with
Time's almost out there.
I see. So well, all I was going to say is your question about the charitable deduction and what's the alternative. And I think that coming out on what the alternative is an advocacy strategy. And so there is a strategy that is, this is why the charitable deduction is very important, and so it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be limited. Another strategy is saying, well, these are what the alternatives are. I think that's about the strategy, and a lot of people have disagreement about what that strategy should be. But what I'll say, and the one thing that I haven't had a chance to disagree with on what Sean said earlier yet, but I'm about to, is that I think that there is significant agreement, not unanimous, but significant agreement in the sector around limitations to the charitable deduction. I think the strategies about how you do it. There's been a lot of discussion the last couple of weeks about, well, should nonprofits be supporting the White House's strategy, increased revenue, or what the strategies are. But my experience over the last couple of years, and the last year especially, is that a vast majority of nonprofits really are in agreement that limitations to the charitable deduction would be bad, and especially at a time when all the government funding for programs is being cut as well. So that's my experience.
I tell you what, why don't we, because we're almost out of time, Sean, why don't you go ahead, why don't we sort of, and I think this is a timely, whether or not we wanted to bring it up, and it may not have been on the horizon to begin with, it obviously is a question, this charitable tax deduction question. And why don't we just, make final comments, starting with Sean, on whatever you want to talk about, but certainly you want to answer this.
I'm going to jump on the red meat Steve just threw at me.
Yes, good.
Yeah, timely. Page A1 of the Washington Post today.
Exactly.
It doesn't get more timely than that.
Right.
Yeah, okay, the charitable deduction happens. You're talking about 1 to 2% of the sector's revenue. Is the sky really falling in? Secondly, it's not either or. How about both? You're trying to defend the charitable deduction, but at the same time, you're also vigorously calling for or supporting the president on the rates, raising the rates on the wealthiest, and very strategic in that it takes the pressure off limiting the charitable deduction. And then finally, you know, the charitable deduction is just one part of this huge fiscal cliff deal that will be announced in the next few days, probably. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's only one component, and we're going to have to make a decision on the whole package. And then as we do, we're going to look at our own mission statement and decide, is this good for our people or not? And I think, and that's why I disagree with you, Steve, I think most nonprofits, if it's a good deal, even if it contains a limitation on the charitable deduction, most nonprofits will say, yeah, we support this, or we're certainly not against it, because it benefits more than hurts the populations we serve.
Anyone else on anything else in front of us? Diana, you don't want to?
I'd just say on the charitable deduction that I have never experienced anything like this in my whole professional life. Having heard from organizations, the tiniest of the tiny to the largest, ones whose names I can't even pronounce, they're so diverse, from states that have never been members of IS. People care about this, and one of the things that's been crossing my mind, because I think you could say that the cuts on the discretionary and entitlement programs would be a much larger chunk of the sector. The estate tax, which I'm surprised never even came up today, going back to 2001 levels, would generate for the sector a lot more money. So why is it that this charitable deduction has had such an emotional, grabbed the sector in such an emotional way? And the only thing I can say, having actually, when I first started in this discussion 4 years ago, and having straddled and gotten hammered on this, is that this defines the sector to themselves, that this has become a threshold issue. The way in which organizations see themselves, it's a century-old tradition in which government recognize that people give, but if they stimulate giving, they will give more, and that it allows people to be generous and to behave in a generous way. And to attack that is to attack their identity. So in some ways it's become decoupled from the amount of money, and it's got to do with protecting our identity. And that's why I think that people won't rest. I just heard from a senior official from the White House yesterday morning. I talked to them a lot, but on this particular subject said to me that they've heard you. And not just you, they've heard from the sector. They were very surprised at the extent of it. And believe me, we didn't organize it. We don't have that kind of campaign money. But that this is coming from people themselves about how they feel. That doesn't mean there aren't different voices, but this is the majority of what we're hearing.
Well, I would just say, beware of the aftermath. And I'm just hoping that we keep in front of us that we're about not just the charitable deduction, but two other things: a more integrated approach of a fair tax system, as well as reasonable solutions that really do safeguard the safety net. I'm hoping that at the end of the day, our sector is not remembered solely for the fight we fought to maintain this charitable deduction, but that it was a piece of a much larger pie. I think that is critical for all of us in this room moving forward.
And I would just close by saying, I wish that all the energy that has gone into preserving the charitable deduction could have been directed towards it. So I would have spent 3.5 years working on this. I would much rather have been working on defending the EITC and ensuring that we have adequate funding for education. But you know, this is a position that I think that we've had to take because we were on the defense, and I really wish that it had gone differently, so we could have focused all this energy and effort on other issues.
Great, very good. Well, let's thank our panel for a terrific conversation. Excellent.
Wow, it's fun. Good to see you again.
I feel like you're a little bit on the Sunday talk show or something.
2 hours is a long time. That's like, wow. Hi, Alex. How you doing there? Yeah, I'm sure I've seen your emails and stuff.
You know, everything you said is right.
Right, exactly,
I just think it's harder to do successfully.
It was fun, huh? Yeah, it was a good discussion.
It was done. I know. And it wasn't for a huge amount of money.
Right.
Some for this.
And now, and suddenly these guys are prepared to spend many multiples of what they spent on this, on some billboards, on the K Street lobbyists. Yes.
Thanks for inviting me. A lot of fun. It's a great discussion. And thanks for writing that report. Like I say, you're gutsy and you put yourself out there and you get a good discussion going.
And I appreciate your comments and I appreciate the respect so much. And I know that we are more together than we are apart, but when we were apart,
Sure, just like today. And if you could turn Gates into an advocate for more advocacy with among other
tell you one
foundations.
thing, if the only downside of the argument is they should use as an excuse a disagreement on very fine points. It was just to achieve the points that we disagree as a reason not to run this. And that party, by the way, I saw some emails talking about that very thing, saying, well, you know, they can't agree on this. And that's
Missing from forest to the trees, like the substantive critique of the report is just quibbles, really. You know? Right. I mean, I spent most of my time talking about not about the report, about the charitable deduction, just because there's not much to quibble about.
right.
Right. But if you can get Gates engaged, that'd be great. Because the other funders will listen to Gates.
Well, not really, but there's a better chance that they're collaborating. Since we can't get anybody to listen to each other.
Well, that's a good point.